Hey, welcome everybody to the September 2023 episode of the bi-monthly FRPanorama webinar series. I'm Larry Liberti, and together with my colleague Mario Alanis, we're happy to be hosting today's seminar. Hi, Mario. How are things?
Hello, good morning and good afternoon, everybody.
Hey, what a pleasure to see everybody here today. Since the start of the program, an average of more than 300 participants from around the world have been registering for these very informative webinars. And as with past webinars, registrants to today's seminar represent people from more than 3 dozen companies, regulatory agencies, universities, NGOs, patient groups, and even trade associations. So we have a very diverse audience. You represent colleagues from all across the world, from Asia and Europe and North America, Latin America, and Africa. So we're looking forward to getting your comments during the session and to be able to address some of those as part of our panel discussion. This webinar series was created to help stakeholders get a practical understanding of how to use and implement and refine the use of reliance pathways. FRPanorama is an educational program of the RUD Foundation, the sponsor of the FRP project. It's a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And we're also very grateful for the ongoing support provided by MSD for the FRPanorama series. And as always, we're indebted to our advisory committee for their input and guidance regarding the topics and the speakers for this webinar. As you can see, we have a very well recognized group of people who participate in this series. It's our hope that by participating in these webinars, you'll get practical advice to address your questions about reliance and to think more about the role and benefits of regulatory reliance. To this end, this is the fifth in our ongoing webinar series, and we know that you now have a very good understanding of the current concepts of reliance, but you're here really to learn more about the practical aspects of how to get the most out of the use of reliance. In prior webinars, and remember, they are all archived at the frpath.org website. We've done deep dives to explore ways to optimize the use of reliance-based pathways. So today, we'll be focusing in on a topic that almost every organization has to address at some point in time. How can we overcome resistance to the use of reliance and optimize its use? So in this episode of the FRPanorama Forum, we're going to be looking at 3 practical ways to overcome resistance and effectively implement reliance in companies and in regulatory agencies alike. So before I introduce today's distinguished presenters, first I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Mario Alanis. And Mario, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Larry. It's always a great pleasure to participate in these webinars. Today, we have a fascinating group of colleagues who are here to share their experiences. I know that sometimes it's difficult to even determine what are the difficulties and resistances within an organization to use reliance pathways. However, today we have great speakers who each have has personal experience in different regulatory aspects that will walk us with practical ways to move ahead with the reliance. Thank you. So, Larry, let's get started.
Okay. Well, thanks, Mario. Today's session is going to last 1 hour and 15 minutes, just as our previous sessions have lasted. We hope that you'll find it to be an excellent use of your time. And please feel free to suggest questions in the chat box. We will monitor those as best we can and then pose those questions to the presenters during the panel discussion towards the end. So today we'll be looking at 3 approaches to overcoming resistance and optimizing the use of reliance. We'll start out with Professor John Skerritt, who will be talking about empowering reviewers to make a fully informed decision using reliance. We'll be followed by Ebru Güzel. She will be talking about ensuring an aligned objective approach within a company, and she's from MSD. And we'll tie it up with Javier Guzman, who will be talking about optimizing communications between agencies and companies to be sure that submissions are moving along the way they should and they're meeting expectations. So I'm very pleased to introduce a colleague who is known to practice everyone here today, Professor John Scarrett. It's really a pleasure the Australian
Thank you, Larry.
Therapeutics Good Administration. John oversaw transformative initiatives at the agency, through which reliance pathways were developed and implemented for the efficient registration of medicines, as you know. For instance, the comparable overseas regulators pathways illustrated that, as the WHO has been advising many, that any agency, irrespective of size or maturity, can benefit from the use of reliance pathways. So how did all this come about? Well, today, John will be sharing some of his experiences about how the agency was able to empower reviewers to feel comfortable making informed decisions using reliance. So to break the ice and introduce our topic today, I'd like to turn it over to Professor John Scarrett.
Thank you very much, Larry, and greetings to everyone. It's 10 minutes past 10 at night here in Melbourne, Australia, but we are at least in the first few days of spring. So it might be dark at the moment, but the sun will be out tomorrow. I've been asked to talk about empowering reviewers in agencies to make a fully informed decision using Reliance. And so I'm going to talk as much about the cultural issues and the influential issues as I am about process and technology and regulation. Because really, at the end of the day, it is about people and people being comfortable making decisions. So if you go back a few years, and even there's an element of this now, many of the top 6 to 7 mature agencies have not relied on or do not have reliance pathways in the same way that many other countries and agencies throughout the world do. There's still this culture of, we're one of the top agencies, we can do it all ourselves. And indeed, prior to 2017, Australia had a one-size-fits-all regulatory pathway for medicines and medical devices. We undertook a full independent review of all the data, even if another regulator had recently reviewed the product. But now, most medicines were approved and reviewed within 200, 230 working days, irrespective of whether it was a breakthrough that dramatically improved therapy for unmet medical need, or if it was the 21st generic of the same medicine. And we also took the same time and did the same level of review, even if the drug had recently been through EMA or FDA or another major regulator. That gave us a very predictable system, but not a very responsive one to patient healthcare professional or industry needs. There had actually been a TGA reliance pathway for about 20 years. People often don't realize that, but it required in law recent evaluation reports from 2 major regulators, both EMA and FDA, not one, but both. And because it required 2 reports, it was hardly ever used, because by the time you got both reports, you might as well submit the drug to TGA and get TGA to do a full evaluation. There was no real benefit for industry. It was difficult to get the 2 sets of reports. Following a major review of the regulatory system in Australia in 2015, 2016, a pathway or 2 pathways known as a comparable overseas regulator, or COR. When you're in Australia, everybody's overseas, even New Zealand. And there were 2 pathways, CORA and CORB, introduced. They were reliance pathways. And there was significant discussion at the time about implementation of a recognition mechanism, as opposed to a reliance mechanism. Apart from some senior politicians, there was actually very little stakeholder support in Australia that we undertake recognition, or as some stakeholders called it, rubber stamping. It was felt that both for consumer confidence and the development of a local biotechnology industry, that Australia had to maintain a full service medicines and medical device regulatory system, and therefore reliance rather than recognition was seen as the way forward. So like the reliance mechanisms used by other regulators, and we looked at the systems used globally at that stage and provided a range of options, and then government introduced what we believe are some of the best ones into law. There's really two. At the end of the day, TGA makes sovereign decisions, but of the two systems, there's one known as Comparable Overseas Regulator A, and that's for a drug that's been approved overseas for less than 1 year, an identical medicine or supply chain or dossier. And indeed, this really is for drugs where there's an extremely high level of sameness. Then there's a second pathway called Comparable Overseas Regulator B, where it's the same medicine and supply chain, but maybe there's been differences in the clinical data, there's been updates, there's been post-approval variations, or perhaps it's been approved more than a year ago. It might have been approved 4 or 5 years ago, and clinical practice does evolve. So that's a high degree of sameness, but you would say not an absolute degree of sameness. And the other thing we did was specify the countries in regulation, and that avoids any trading and negotiations. Oh, look, we've got a report from this country, why don't you accept it? And we recognize Canada, Japan, Singapore, Switzerland, US, UK, US FDA, and the European Medicines Agency, both the centralized and decentralized processes into that scheme. Now, until April this year, so my data's a little bit out of date, about 18 medicines have been approved. I think it's probably about 20 by now that have been approved through these pathways. Separately, other systems involving work sharing and information sharing also were developed. Now, they're not the usual forms of regulatory reliance because it's not a case of taking a complete dossier where a decision's already been made and reviewing it. But they are still relevant because there are other ways where we work together with other regulators. So access involves working with a range of other regulators on different modules within the dossier. And of course, Project Orbis is an FDA-led global collaborative review focused on oncology medicines. And it involves parallel or collaborative review of a dossier, but it leverages FDA resources. So it's not reliance in the normal fashion, but it does bring the regulators together to discuss decisions before they're made. And when we asked FDA, who are much more resourced than any other regulator, why they've brought in other countries, the old story is 2 heads are better than 1, but it gives confidence in the decisions that are made. And under Orbis, there's been 51 submissions approved in the last 3 or 4 years, including 21 new molecular entities. Now, I was asked to reflect on who was resistant to regulatory reliance. And I wanted to look at the internal issues among regulators because it was quite a foreign concept. And a lot of our evaluators who were doing the drug evaluation said, well, hold on, we're a full service regulator. We don't need to look at what other regulators have done. Across the organization, and I'm giving the warts and all version of this, it was really the clinical evaluators, the medical doctors and their support people who were looking at Module 5, the clinical part of the dossier. They were the most resistant. And often it was the ones who frankly reviewed the fewest new drugs every year who objected the most loudly. That's an interesting point. There was some resistance from the toxicologists, even though they felt that they were overworked. And again, reliance can be a major work saver for people within the organization if they only have to dive down to the parts of the dossier that they want to question further, rather than review every part of it in detail. The CMC quality people were fairly used to it and comfortable with it. They were used to working with other groups like EDQM in Strasbourg. And of course, the laboratories used batch release for vaccines, and they had other international collaborative protocols, as did the GMP inspectors. There's a system of GMP mutual reliance on GMP clearances through PICs and other form of things. So really, we identified within our organization who we had to win the hearts and minds of. And I said the clinical evaluators in particular were the ones we had to work with to encourage them to understand the benefits of reliance internally for the organization. What were their concerns? Well, that's always the first part. You know, it doesn't matter if you change a brand of coffee in the coffee room. If people are worried, you've got to find out what their concerns are. And their main concerns were that their professional skills were being undermined, which really, when we sat down with them, we said, well, hold on, there's still work for everyone, and there's a lot of work. There's not going to be job losses because we actually have very many applications in front of you. And then they didn't really say they understood the qualifications of the other reviewers. And again, when you sat and talked back through, you realised that the reviewers in places like Canada, the Europe and the US were actually just as highly, if not more trained than Australian reviewers. Some of them were concerned they couldn't see the original data. Well, of course they could. One of the conditions that was built into our reliance mechanisms is a full dossier had to be submitted, as well as any, say, evaluations by EMA or Canada or Singapore or another country that was considered on the list. And that enabled our evaluators could immediately go and look at that data in more detail. It was at their fingertips. They were concerned that they wouldn't be given enough time to review it. And at least in the initial years, we were pretty relaxed about giving them enough time to do the evaluation. But we were very worried that some evaluators might fall into the trap of not only reading the report from the other regulator, but still evaluating the full original data from end to end. Our evaluators were also concerned about the workload in getting the reports. And so in law, we made it the responsibility of a sponsor. So TGA didn't have to run around and get the reports. It's more challenging with FDA because FDA don't provide a single compiled report for drugs that get a positive decision. The other thing is that other regulators felt that answering questions from us or answering questions from us answering questions from other regulators would add to workload. Well, it did, but answering a few questions is still less than evaluating a whole dossier. And we appointed case managers to support the evaluators and manage the late night teleconferences and do the emails and so forth. Finally, some evaluators felt that they would be legally liable if they hadn't seen all the original data and hadn't reviewed it personally. But again, it was explained to them by our lawyers that that wasn't the case. But there's nothing in law that says the original evaluator has to see all the original data. So it was a case of listening respectfully to their issues and going through them one by one. So how did we really address it? We stimulated company demand, even though there's no fee reduction for comparable overseas regulators of medicines. There are fee reductions for medical devices. But the main benefits for industry are really the speed of review and not being asked the same questions several times by different regulators or by us if they've already adequately answered them elsewhere. And indeed, acceptance by the evaluators has now significantly increased. Now, frankly, there have been some staff who have really turned their views around and are now strongly supportive. In other cases, it's a usual thing in any organisation. The staff who didn't like the coffee retired or resigned. And so some change of staff, but also many changing their mind frame. The other thing that we shouldn't overestimate is it does take a lot of time. We build on confidence building activities that were already underway to support access. And indeed, we had international staff placements as far back as 2010, 2011. So even though formally we only introduced the reliance pathways in 2017, we'd had staff working with these other regulators since 2010. There was a bit of top-down push, just saying, look, it's now the law, it's now the government policy that we do reliance, and that there was support from the medical fraternity and from industry and from patient groups. We also developed internal SOPs on when the original data would have to be looked at by exception. We supported staff getting to know by video conference and occasionally face-to-face their colleagues in other countries. And we identified opinion leaders who would work with their peers to explain that the sky would not fall in if you did a review based on reliance. And it wasn't about cutting staff, and we walked the talk. It wasn't about dumbing down the training of reviewers. So no one approach helped overcome internal resistance to the use of reliance. It was the same as any other change process. I said flippantly, it's like changing the brand of coffee in the lunchroom, but it's the same as any workplace change process. A mixture of peer review, a mixture of engagement, a mixture of being able to answer the questions that are asked. And I guess just to wrap up, were the issues with work sharing and Orbis information sharing different to regulatory reliance? Well, I guess if regulatory reliance is a dating exercise, then work sharing must be a form of marriage because you're going in a lot more deep as far as trust goes. Essentially, with work sharing, you're actually devolving the whole review of a whole part of a whole module in a dossier to another regulator. But on the other hand, it's a more interactive process, perhaps, than using a comparable overseas regulator. But both work sharing and use of reliance, when you fast forward to 2023, both the use of reliance and work sharing are now widely accepted internally. There's still some caution about the application of these processes to ATMPs or cell and tissue products, given the smaller clinical trial data sets and the higher uncertainty in many cases around risk benefit for those products. But we have a framework for confidence building as we expand the use of those products. So just to wrap up, Larry, actually the title of your webinar today is wrong. There are no easy ways to overcome resistance, and certainly it wasn't an easy journey for us to overcome resistance. It was initially that it was seen as adding work, not taking away from work, because as I said, some reviewers wanted to still do a full review of the original dossier and look at the reviews from a partner country. So it created more work. There were challenges sometimes in that we weren't operating to our own timeframes and that we were actually having to do things faster, because for comparable overseas regulators, the timeframes are reduced. Industry gets their reviews in 120 working days, for example, with comparable overseas regulator A. The other challenge that we had, of course, were the endless late night video and teleconferences. Unfortunately, Australia is geographically challenging in that many of the discussions with other regulators happen to take part at 10 p.m., 11 p.m. or midnight, inconvenient times. And finally, if I could challenge the FRPanorama people and FRPath with a job to do, there still is no central or even semi-dispersed list of countries that rely on each other. I was asked a couple of months ago, what countries in the world accept TGA reviews? And TGA reviews are actually used by about 20 to 25 countries. The only way I could get that answer was to send about 10 or 15 emails and to do a lot of internet and website research. So regulators are very reluctant to put up lists of countries that rely on them. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, but perhaps we can discuss that, because I think it would be a step forward if there were central lists of who relied on who. So thanks very much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, John. What a great icebreaker and a way to set the stage. Thanks also for pointing out that there are no easy answers, right? That this takes time. Just to your point about a centralized list, you've kind of sparked a neuron, and within the FRPath database, we actually identify who relies on who. And I think with a little bit of programming, we can actually very easily create a tabulation of who relies on who. So I think Mario and I are going to talk a little bit about this and see if we can get the programmer to do some clever programming to extract that information. Obviously, you know, so much of this, like you say, is based on what data you have in the database. And sometimes it's hard to actually figure out those interactions. But that's a great suggestion. And I think we're going to take that under advisement, because with not much work, I think we can answer your question.
Great.
Thanks again. Beautiful. You know, I'm constantly reminded that the efficient use of regulatory reliance pathways is a two-sided coin. Now, we've heard about how an agency ensures that reliance pathways can be implemented. And it's also important to realize that from the company side, there needs to be an aligned approach throughout the organization to support the use of reliance and to ensure its successful implementation and the successful culmination of the activity. So how does this work, especially across a large multinational company? So with this in mind, I'd like to turn to our next presenter, Ebru Güzel. Ebru is the Regulatory Affairs Director and Regional Liaison with MSD Europe, and has been involved in developing international submission strategies and comes with much experience in this area. So today, Ebru will share with us some of her thoughts on ensuring an aligned objective and approach within a company, and how to use the reliance efficiently and effectively. So Ebru, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks, Larry, for the nice introduction. And as you have mentioned, I would be talking on the other side of the coin, and I will be giving the company perspectives today and how we ensure that we use the best possible reliance pathways in the company. So, well, within the recent years, as we all know, we have seen a great increase in the local health authorities moving towards the use of reliance pathways. And some of them are more established, some are not yet, but trying to implement the procedures. But there had been a lot of interest. So this is why within MSD, we have tried to ensure to put a structured approach and to use these reliance pathways as best as possible. So I would like to point out here that there are different considerations you should be taking into account internally in a company when using reliance pathways, and we have thought about them. And first point I would like to make today is this is not a kind of, let's say, automatically driven decision. So this is very much case-by-case assessment and decision, really. This depends on different factors, a product-specific, it can be a country-specific decision or even region-specific decision. So this is why we have thought that putting some criteria for an assessment, broader assessment, before the decision would also help us kind of to move this request within the organization. Of course, on the other for the next step, we also try to identify which decision points or which decision and alignment points we need to go through. Of course, this really depends on how the company works, how does the governance committees work, and the structure. And as a last point, we also wanted to capture our learnings and experiences as a result of all these efforts. And we wanted to learn from experience for our next program or product in order to continue to be successful in this. So now I will be touching base a bit more in detail the criteria for the assessment. So first of all, I would like to point out that my talk today is much more focusing on the new product filings. I'm not talking on the lifecycle management reliance part of it. So just for first reminder. And the second one is this is really a cross-functional teamwork within the company. So when you are making an assessment for a possible reliance pathway in a specific country, in a region, you need to work closely with your stakeholders. So we have identified some criteria. This may apply, to all of them may apply for a product. Not all of them may apply. So this really depends on the requirements, local environment, and internal procedures. First one was, of course, the health authority requirements, because we have seen that each and every local health authority may not necessarily request the same. So this may differ, and this is very diverse even across regions as well. So the first thing to understand is what does health authority request from us to use a reliance pathway? We need to understand this to start right from the first time. So this is why we need to identify what do they request from us, which type of documents we have to submit in addition to normal standard pathways. Does the health authority actually sometimes mandate to use a reliance pathway? This also happens. Even you may not want to go for it, health authority can ask for it. And we really need to clarify all this. And also there is one point here which we find useful is to do some pre-submission meetings, if applicable, to align first with the health authority what is the exact asks there. So, of course, then internally we need to identify if there is any kind of internal support needed, additional support needed, when we compare it to the standard routes. So what do I mean here is, for example, reliance pathways theoretically accelerates things. So the point where you have health authority questions can be quite shorter than normal pathways, and the timelines you have to reply back is also very stretched. So this kind of things should be considered internally. If you are operating globally in a lot of countries, this should be also considered. Of course, we try to learn from experience, and the previous products that has used these pathways, we are also looking into that experiences. So this helps us to identify what benefits we gained, what were the challenges, was it really the acceleration we gained, did we receive less questions, or was it still a lot of questions or no questions? So we try to understand from this internal intelligence. On top of it, as a complementary information, the intelligence, external intelligence, is important. What I mean by that is, in the specific country, what are the other companies doing? And if we, of course, I know this is not something we can sometimes not reach, and it's not transparent, but this is from a regulatory external intelligence via the pharma associations and working groups, we can understand the local environment from our colleagues in the same country. Another aspect we look into is IP and confidentiality. Are there, what I mean by that, are there, for example, agreements, confidentiality agreements between the reference country and the local country health authorities? Is it possible for them to share information? So we may not see this in all cases. And then, if not, then should we be providing the, for example, assessment report or from the reference authority as an applicant? Is there a safe way to do this, and how we should do this? So these are the aspects we are looking into. And I just want to highlight again here the cross-functional evaluation, maybe beyond regulatory. We need to align with our stakeholders. So for the access piece, for example, market access, because this really may impact our access to patients strategy. If we want to go with a reliance pathway, if we go and get the approval faster, is it aligned with reimbursement? Is it aligned with our access strategy? Is pricing an element, and how should it be impacted when we go faster with reliance? Or medically, is it an unmet need for that specific country, and even health authority requests us to file with reliance? So these are different considerations, but as mentioned, all these considerations may not be applicable for each and every program, but we are trying to evaluate them as much as possible for the applicable products. So after doing this assessment internally with the stakeholders, we are trying to identify opportunities and risks to use a reliance pathway in a specific country. Of course, we also need to align with our product development teams globally, as we are kind of operating regionally and globally. So we try to identify the best decision flow, internal decision flow, which teams we have to go, which colleagues we have to align with. So we are doing it, and we also request a final decision from the respective product development cross-functional teams. And again, I would like to emphasize here, this is a case-by-case evaluation, internal evaluation and a decision, and one size does not fit all. So this really depends on the product, on the therapeutic area, indication sometimes, and even the data the health authority request, the content of it. So this is really very different for each and every program. So what we have done after doing the assessment, going for the decision, if we are okay and filed with Reliance, we also want to capture what we have achieved or what we have learned as kind of from that experience. So this is why across regions we are trying to consolidate our internal experience for some years now, and we are trying to identify all the products that we used these pathways. And what was the business driver to use this? Was it kind of our internal drivers? Was it health authority driver? Which type of reliance was it? Because the definitions can be really different from country to country. And the level of, as well, assessment may differ. And then we also capture which product teams, which teams we went for alignment. And at the end, we try to identify our achievements and learnings for each and every case so as to improve it for the next time. So I believe this is my last slide, just to maybe start rethinking of what can you do in order to, if you have not done so far, I'm just talking to my company colleagues that are attending today. If there is a way you can structure your internal assessment so that you can guide for the next product, for the next team who wants to use a Reliance, guide them to use this structured approach, and as well try to hand over this experience as well to the next teams. So this is the internal part. Please maybe start thinking around it if you have not done so far. And as well, of course, there is the external part of it, the health authority part of it, let me call it, because as a company, and I'm sure all of us as companies would like to be successful with this Reliance pathways. So in order to ensure the next, pathway usage would also be aligned with the teams. So this is why we also have some asks from health authorities. We would like them to the pathways, the guidelines. We really want to have more harmonized, more maybe requirement-wise, more harmonized requirements, and as well, the health authorities also would be, sticking to the timelines in order to make sure this is working properly. Of course, also we would like to know, what to expect, and if a procedure a reliance procedure defined as a full reliance or a limited assessment, we would like to see that working that way, and we wouldn't like to have unexpected maybe questions or too many questions, let me call it. So the concept should be implemented on the health authority side as well, as much as possible, as streamlined as possible. But I know this is not a straightforward ask. And on that piece, as a company, our local regulatory colleagues, as well our policy colleagues on the local side, they are working diligently with the health authorities in order to streamline and align even before a reliance procedure or guideline is issued. So there are a lot of effort ongoing from that part as well. So I believe I can now stop my presentation and thanking the organization, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A piece as well. Thank you so much.
Ebru, I want to thank you very much, because I have to say, I think this is one of the first times, and Mario, you can chime in, that I've actually heard the process from start to finish, from starting from evaluating criteria, saying we should get everybody in the same room, have the teams work together, think about all of these various criteria, all the way through to what was our experience and how does that feed back to the bigger picture across all of our experiences, and how do we make that a learning cycle? So I want to thank you very much, because I think this is something that sometimes we take for granted that it occurs within an organization. And I know my experience in talking to organizations is that it actually doesn't happen that often. And I think this sets a very, very good baseline for others to learn from your experiences. So thanks very, very much for that. So let me turn it over to Mario. Mario, why don't you
Yes,
go ahead and
Larry, it's been fascinating to hear all these practical experiences from both the regulatory and the company point of view. It's fascinating, and from a company that participates in many parts of the world, that they are continuously assessing across regions, and even to evaluate where to go first, and where it's easier, and I guess regulatory agencies don't realize sometimes that companies are deciding based on their experience with reliance and other aspects. So it's thanks, and all recommendations have been great. But we are ready to continue, and it is now my pleasure to introduce our final guest. It's my dear colleague Javier Guzman. Javier is currently Director of Global Health Policy and Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development. He brings years of experience working with health and regulatory issues in different parts. He was director of his home country regulatory agency, Colombia, one of the regional regulatory agencies in Latin America. And he has participated in different international agencies and organizations dealing with improving efficiency and effectiveness of health systems and optimizing regulatory systems. Today, at his role at the Center for Global Development, he helps and promotes global health through effective organizational interactions. And indeed, that's a very important aspect when it comes to reliance. One of the key aspects for success is being able to communicate between the agency and the companies so that submissions meet expectations. So we are very glad, and welcome again, Javier. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mario and Larry. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. If we can start the presentation, I know we don't have a lot of time. So I guess what I wanted to say is, a bit of the framework in which we are all discussing reliance and some of the angles and the lessons learned, especially in Latin America. So I think, if we look at the definition of reliance, I just wanted to point out to two things. One is it's not just decisions, but it's also information. And I think it is important to keep in mind that a lot of regulatory agencies in middle-income countries do not have the capacity to do assessments from scratch and should prioritize their resources to get value for money. And therefore, a lot of organizations in those countries will rely on decisions made by other countries. That is to some extent different to what you get in a lot of high-income countries, where you get reliance based on data rather than decisions. But clearly, I think if we look at the why and if we look at the what, it is important to prioritize the areas in which reliance will make the biggest impact and will have the biggest bang for the buck. And this alignment between risk-based regulation and smart approaches to increase efficiency, effectiveness, and public health benefit is key. So I guess the first point I would like to make is it comes down to being specific about how you get started and what the entry points are and what the specific products that you'll actually be improving reliance on. And that is important because you will provide clarity to all stakeholders. So I guess if we look at what manufacturers are expecting from regulators, is we just heard, we heard that manufacturers want consistency, they want transparency, they want, to some extent, convergence of guidelines and requests. But if you look at the other stakeholders, of course, drug regulatory authorities also want to maximize the benefit of using these reliance approaches. And patients will benefit and donors will benefit, especially if we talk about regulatory agencies where the capacity is not there and are going through a development exercise, a continuum. So, I don't need to say, to say this, but it also, a key element here, which oftentimes is not considered, is we've got complex supply chains, and we know that it's impossible for a regulator to fully have oversight of the entire supply chain. But this comes with complications, because we've seen and clearly we felt in the region that it is different to approach reliance when you have manufacturing capacity in country than if you don't. And it's different if you do have an industrial policy in country or if you don't. And I guess there are things that should be taken into account when considering the best entry points for different countries to foster reliance. And it's not, I understand, the point has been made that it's all about, or a lot has been said about marketing authorization, and a lot has been said about, the dossier and how you make sure that you reduce the time from first registration in the first country to the other registrations, and how can you leverage registrations in high-income countries and other agencies. But I wanted to say, sometimes the best way to get started is actually with other regulatory functions. Other regulatory functions when you don't have as much tension or as much implications for the markets. And that basically means, if you are able to as a regulatory agency, if you are able to start reliance with other regulatory functions and build critical mass and, tackle some of the hesitations and put in place the legal and the policy framework for other, more difficult or challenging reliance approaches to be in place, I think that's a very nice starting point. And on the flip side, if you look at companies and if we look at, how companies will adjust, also entry points like this will benefit. So based on the experience I've seen, I think, and the question I was asked, you cannot, as a regulator, provide consistent, clear, transparent approaches unless you have a good policy framework in place. And at least, and in a lot of countries, regulators are asked to, make progress on reliance, but do not have the legislative and the policy framework to do so. So to some extent, regulators, as we all know, are risk averse and will not actually go and do things that are not explicitly included in the legislative framework. So providing this legislative framework where regulators have the flexibility, where regulators can actually, incorporate new pathways, incorporate new approaches, is I think, an essential element to get started. And that is also essential because on the flip side, it provides the transparency that companies need, the transparency that other regulators need, and the consistency in terms of what the procedures are, what the expectations are, what the overall pathway is. We just heard from our previous speaker how companies do not value when they do not have a certain explicit laid out approach from the get-go. And I guess, the prerequisite for that to happen is for the regulatory agency, one, to see the value in coming with these elements, and two, having the legislative and the policy framework to do so. The other important point I would mention here is reliance needs to be flexible. So that flexibility needs to be embedded within, the interactions between companies and regulators and within the policy and legislative framework in which regulators operate. We've seen some of these examples in Latin America. This is a table from a study conducted by the Pan American Health Organization a few years ago with the national regulatory agencies of regional reference. And what we saw was basically information is not available, information is not there. It's very difficult for regulators to assess whether the product they want to do reliance on is the same as the product that has been regulated elsewhere. And that is particularly difficult because on one hand, regulators do not publish and do not include the data, but on the other hand, because companies do not provide all the data that they could in their submissions or in their interactions with the regulatory agency. So if you look at this example in terms of the marketing authorization of generics, the only thing that is common across the national regulatory agencies of regional reference in the Americas is a searchable database. But that searchable database doesn't allow you to be clear that it is the same product, that it is the same formulation, that is the same quantitative, qualitative formula, that is the same product characteristics, that is the same, packaging, that is the same manufacturing site. So that all complicates the conversation, and I guess we have to assume that if that is not guaranteed, then the regulators will not feel at ease in incorporating these approaches. So I guess importantly, I talked about transparency, I talked about consistency, I talked about certainty, but at the same time, I think we should also talk about providing information on both sides. So regulators providing information on what can be made publicly accessible, and companies providing information to regulators in their interactions as needed or beyond what's needed. And I think the current trend is something that we should not forget about, and the current trend moving away from stringent regulatory authorities to WHO listed authorities providing platforms where countries can feel at ease in terms of having work sharing agreements or having explicit exchanges of information. COVID was really helpful in terms of data sharing and information exchange. All that will actually increase and help with having a network of trusted compliant authorities. So I guess I would argue that it is important for companies and regulators to leverage these existing platforms and existing fora where these discussions can be made and where trust can be built. But having said that, a lot of these platforms are not really used by regulators, at least in the Americas. So if you look at PICS, for instance, only 2 out of the 6 national regulatory authorities of regional reference are part of it. So I guess that is important for regulators to join those networks, but to see the benefits of joining those networks, and for companies to also incorporate those elements in the way they actually design their strategies to register products and beyond, as I said, other regulatory functions. So I guess just to sum up, I just wanted to say we cannot go far if we don't have a very clear policy and legal framework in country. And that is a prerequisite, that is an essential element. And regulators oftentimes are not the ones passing the legislation clearly. So oftentimes it's Congress, but oftentimes it's done by decree at the presidential level or is at the Ministry of Health level. So I think it is important for companies to take this into account, to incorporate this in the conversations with ministries of health and with governments in terms of providing an enabling legal and policy framework for regulators in which they should operate. The second point is, I think, how consistency, transparency is needed, and that's needed to build trust and improve engagement. And it's not just, as we heard from the first speaker, something that will happen overnight. So we need to find the right angle in terms of find the right entry point, find the right regulatory function to get started with, find the right existing mechanism to leverage. I think the existing mechanisms will provide or do provide a very good starting point, but all this will not materialize without data. And I think data is essential, both in terms of companies providing the data that's needed to regulators to understand that the product is the same on one hand, and that the regulatory landscape that has been that the company has gone through for that particular product, and on the other hand, for regulators to also provide publicly available data as needed to support other regulators to rely on those decisions and on that data. Without that, then you get into a lot of regulators and a lot of companies single-handedly handling the challenge and trying to make progress on their own, which I don't think will take us that far. With that, thank you very much, and I'll pass it back to you, Larry and Mario. Thanks.
Thanks, Javier. Very, very important topics that you've brought up here. And we have a few minutes to start deep diving into this. We've heard from our three presenters around the world about these key issues. And, we're trying to figure out what are the practical ways of moving this forward. And we've gotten some very, very good insights in the last hour from them. We do have a couple of comments and questions from our participants, and I thought we could use them to springboard a conversation. One of the things you mentioned, John, was how the clinical reviewers found it a little bit challenging to sort of give up their ability to review. One of the things, and Mario, you can join in here, one of the things that we've seen when we go to especially emerging, maturing agencies, they kind of seem to be okay with looking at the clinical information and say, yeah, there's not much more we can add. But where they become very, very fixed, if you want to call it, is on the CMC. They feel less flexibility there. And one of the comments that came from our audience is, how is it that a reviewer might be asked to overcome things like climate zone differences and changes with regard to the stability of products, and so this CMC topic we've seen as being sometimes a real challenge for low and middle income countries. And so I'll start with you, John, and then perhaps Ebru and Javier, you can talk a little bit about experiences you've had with regard to how reviewers take a look at information.
Well, I think it probably comes down to the staffing balance of the different organizations. You mentioned emerging economies, and as you know, I've actually come from 25 years in working in collaboration with developing countries, especially more in Asia Pacific than in Africa and Latin America. And what we found in our programs of collaboration with regulators in Asia Pacific is what they focused on, and this might sound a little bit cruel, but it's the truth. What they focused on related to their training. So we went to one particular regulator of a middle-sized country I won't name, and they really spent a lot of time looking at the microbiology, look at the toxicology, and a little bit at the analytical chemistry aspects of a dossier, and hardly any time looking at the clinical aspects. And that really surprised us. And so we asked for a staff profile, and it turned out that this regulator had about one medical doctor on their whole staff of 200. But they happened to have 10 toxicologists and 17 analytical chemists and so forth. And so they looked at what they were skilled at looking at. Now, I think even big regulators can have that same phenomenon, but we especially found this with some developing country regulators, that they would focus on their areas of expertise. In many countries where it's just so hard to get enough medical doctors, even to do frontline care and hospital care, regulators do often suffer. We have found that the smaller and less well-resourced regulators have very few medical doctors, and therefore often the clinical part, especially if another regulator from a bigger country or better resourced country has looked at it, they tend to take that as being okay because it's already been looked at and have the skills in-house. So I do think, I guess to summarize, I think sometimes what individual country regulators look at depends on the balance of skills they have in those regulators.
That's very interesting. I think we've seen that, right, Mario? That
yes,
kind of balance and I don't want to say bias, but emphasis, right? But Ebru, before I turn it over to you, there is a comment that's kind of tied in with that from our audience, and it's considering the experience you've had with working with international teams, how do you handle when these questions about additional resources, requirements are posed? it could be that there's this focus on stability or CMC because that's the expertise of the agency. How do you respond to that? And you've touched on this with regard to having communications and early alignment, but I was wondering if there was anything else you might want to add to that.
Yeah, the first thing, as you also mentioned, is really the alignment with the health authority request, actually, to understand better the background, the requirement itself, clarify it really. And then, discussing it with the international teams, you can understand what you can provide and what you cannot. So sometimes even some of the requirements for a specific product, you cannot provide it. And that means you cannot use the pathway. So the first example, for each country is always the hardest one. So this is why by experience, what we observe by experience internally is that as the product teams become available with the requirement type for that specific country, for example, second time or third time, it may be a bit easier because you have already invested in the educational part of it internally with the stakeholders. So this makes it easier for the next time for the same product team or different product team, but for the same country. But we also try to do a health authority interaction alignment a lot with the local, as mentioned, regulatory and policy colleagues. And even we want to kind of, give some comments for those, guidelines which are still in draft. We try to, maybe give our comments ahead of time and explain why, the reasons why. So this is a two-sided activity, internally and externally. And I think education piece is the real important part here. I also would like to, maybe to the previous question, I would like to emphasize one thing regarding the health authority perspectives. We also find it very useful when the health authorities meet with each other, share experience. Even sometimes the countries that has implemented Reliance for some years and not necessarily requesting so many additional, let's say, documents, as a best practice and succeeded with it, if that authority shares experience with other and how do they, did they implement it, it also helps a lot. So this is how we have been, let's say, observing it internally and externally.
That's great. And Javier, before I turn it to you, that we have another comment that's sort of tied in with that. And John, you may want to chime in on this. It has to do with best practices, as Edward just brought out. And how do you ensure that the staff at the agency are focusing their efforts on what's important and not taking too much time or going kind of off track, but focusing on what they can provide as best added value? So what are your ideas around the discussion?
Well, one of the ways was really, I guess, playing to their strengths and saying, look, what are the big things that you look at in a review, irrespective of whether you're doing the review itself, whether it's a review that you've contracted out to a university or academic group in Australia, or whether it's a report that you've received from a overseas regulator. So we encourage, as far as best practice, we encourage them before they jumped in and started reading the documents they received overnight, because they'd come in overnight by email. We encourage them to sit back and think about what the issues they would have when they did an initial look at the dossier, when they did an initial look at the summary around the drug, and obviously there's obvious things with an oncology drug. You look at effects on metastases development, on overall survival, not just on intermediate biomarkers and so forth. So we would ask them to sit and think about the big questions. That actually got their thinking a little bit more structured before they would go in and look at the report of a comparable overseas regulator. Now, there is a bit of a challenge because even I mentioned with developing countries that sometimes there's a little bit of a bias. We found that some countries would do certain areas of the dossier for review in much more depth than we would normally do it. Some countries will do a lot more detailed clinical evaluation for example, and other countries will do a lot more detailed preclinical evaluation. And other countries, and I won't mention countries, really do a very extensive review of a CMC. So apart from looking at the depth of the review that was a characteristic of a country, we actually asked our reviewers to sit back and think about the issues that were going to be important and potential deal breakers to the approval of that drug.
That's great. And Javier, I'll turn it to you because you sort of touched on this with this concept of risk-based guidance and risk-based assessments. So the floor is yours.
Well, the first thing I wanted to say is, regulators normally have this first come, first served basis approach, which is oftentimes included in the law, but oftentimes it's just the way it has historically been. And I think that needs to change. And for that to change, you need to have adequate legal provisions, because to be able to make changes on what you prioritize, what you don't prioritize, what you focus your resources on, you as a regulator need to have the flexibility to make those decisions within the policy and legislative framework. Often, it's also a change in mindset in terms of it is not about trying to approve X number of products or try to go through X number of transactions. I think if you change that mindset to see what's the biggest value that I could bring with the resources available and with the limitations available, how can you adjust the processes to reflect that? It's a breakthrough, and that requires leadership. And we saw what John was saying in terms of his experience in Australia, but it also requires critical mass. A lot of inspectors, a lot of evaluators will not feel at ease feeling that they're not doing their job, or that they're actually being transition out of their job. So all that is part of the conversation. My first point is, one, it comes from the legal and the policy framework. Two, the political leadership and the leadership within the agency at the highest level. And three, the critical mass that's needed for this to change. One additional point that maybe I should mention is, I think performance-based indicators and identifying what should be measured to demonstrate performance and impact is essential. And that's a regional and a global public good that, a lot of stakeholders could work on. So I see how, for instance, PAHO could work on it, how entities like Asian could work on it. And that basically provides the adequate signals to the regulators in terms of what's value for investment.
That's a very, very good point. Mario, I'll turn to you. We just have a minute or
All
so.
right. Thank you, Larry. Just very briefly, I thought it was very interesting because, for example, from John, I could see many of the reviewers' resistance that I thought it was more of developing countries. They were very similar to those in a strict agency. And with Javier, I wanted to share that we have been working on a study of reliance. And indeed, what you mentioned, the intentional policy and legal framework importance, it does make a difference when you measure how effective reliance has been. Where it has been more successful is when it tends to be more formal, which I would understand as intentional legal, than when it's not. So it is a very good point that I wanted to. And then the other part is the flexibility, how to combine flexibility with the legal. Sometimes you mentioned embedded, which I think it was a very important way to do it. Just wanted to bring up these comments in case somebody would like to react, or you, Larry.
Well, thanks, Mario. I think that's a great way to sort of tie up the session. As always, I've found that this has been a very special session. So much has been learned. We believe that reliance pathways are valuable. no doubt about that. And today we've taken steps to understand more about how we can consider optimizing awareness and the collaborative implementation of reliance in many different stakeholder scenarios here. And I want to thank our speakers, for leaving us with some brilliant insights and practical advice. So let's summarize some of these practical key actions, because that's one of the key elements of our FRPanorama series, is that we want to leave you with actions that you can take away right now. So let's take the first one. If you're a company and you have regulatory approval from a major regulator, go ahead and ask the regulator in your country how they can use that approval to streamline the review. So as Eberhard said, let's go ahead and learn from our experience. As John has mentioned, let's go ahead and be able to share information as effectively as possible. So that's our first topic. Our second is start thinking about how to structure your internal processes to evaluate and decide how to use reliance pathways. Again, we heard how you can use checklists, how you can identify characteristics and weight those characteristics depending on the location, the product type, etc. So very good. Be sure you have something in place, right? And thirdly, information is really essential to enable reliance. We heard this from all our speakers, and Javier really stressed this. A key element is to guarantee that the product being regulated is the same. And this whole concept of sameness, which we are going to explore a little bit more in our next webinar, which we'll talk about in just a minute. This means that the stakeholders can facilitate reliance by providing and making public good information to allow sameness to be confirmed. And this comes back to what we're talking about. What is it that particular agencies are focused on learning about? So I think importantly, we can each think about how we individually and as an organization can consider implementing, one or more of these actions today. Go back to your desk and think about, do we have these things in place? So with that, I'd like to remind you that a recording of this session will be archived at the frpath.org website. The previous sessions are archived there. They're available for free. And I hope that the suggestions and observations that have come from our session today will help you in your activities. So just as a little bit of a reminder, our next webinar will be held on Tuesday, November 14th, and we'll be dotting the I's on our year-long deep dive into reliance when we address the topic of 3 best practices for the effectiveness and efficient use of reliance pathways. So sort of tying together what's happened over the last year and developing some practical advice. We'll be addressing sameness and how do we convey consistency in the submission. We'll be talking about critical thinking and applying science-based approaches to regulatory agility, like Javier talked about, having flexibility, and metrics and characteristics that can be implemented to understand and monitor the use of reliance. So this whole concept of what are the really good performance-based metrics that we should be focusing on. So we'll be sending you details in the near future, or you'll be able to register soon at the frpath.org website, where you can find more information about reliance and other facilitated regulatory pathways. So once again, Mario and I would like to extend a very special thank you to our guest, Professor John Skerritt, Ebru Guzel, and to Javier Guzman. Thank you very much for your insights today. And we want to thank you all for your interest and participation, and all our best until we meet again.
Thanks.